White not only collected and dealt in antique frames, but used them as inspiration for new designs, both adapting and adding to old frames, as well as copying bits and pieces of ornament which struck his fancy. In one method of frame making, White would initially sketch out his ideas, here on the back of a small scrap of McKim, Mead, and White stationery. Then a more finished drawing would be executed by one of the draftsmen. In this particular frame, White embellished what is noted as an antique frame by adding a broken pediment and columns. It is also interesting to note here that White got two bids on the work, one from Oscar Rudolph, who made many of his frames after 1895, and the other from Worth and Fife. The finished drawing would be given to the frame maker with the details sketched in the frame made. Afterwards, White would direct the gilding of the frame, outlining the specific tint of gold as well as which parts were to be burnished or otherwise finished. The completed work on Robert Sewell's Bacchante is seen hanging over the mantel in the green room of White's house. In looking at White's own designs, there are several distinctions which separate them from earlier frames. For general frame design, White was impressed by Sir Charles Eastlake's postulate that moldings should slope outward from the painting rather than the usual inward slope, which tended to cast shadows on the picture. He was influenced as well by artists such as Whistler, who designed his own picture frames because he was dissatisfied with what was available. Whistler adapted ornament to fit specific paintings, as seen here on his Caprice in purple and gold at the Freer Gallery of Art. The other frame by White on a St. Gaudens relief of Mildred Howells shows a similar flat surface with spare, carefully chosen ornament. The frames which Stanford White designed from scratch may be divided into several categories, including early carved frames for sculpture, tabernacle frames, frames composed of various combinations of related designs which can be classified as grill, acanthus, arabesque or U decoration, fish scale, basket weave, rows of moldings, and finally, a group of special and unique designs. White drew upon a vast number of sources in the ornament and design which he adapted for frames. There are some patterns in certain artists frequently getting a particular type or design of frame. The vast majority of frames which White designed were done for his artist friends, including Augustus St. Gaudens, Thomas Wilmer Dewing, Abbot Thayer, and Dwight Tryon. It is also worth noting that for White, designing frames was a labor of love. He wrote in 1889 that he had never yet designed a frame as a matter of business. It would seem as well that Stanford White did not generally accept money for his designs. He was always eager to help people, especially artists. Indeed, it had been said that friendship was a sort of religion to White. White's closest artist friend was Augustus St. Gaudens, for whom we have already seen White made statuary bases. Among the earliest frames which White created are those surrounding St. Gaudens' sculptural reliefs. The marble bas-relief of White's wife Bessie was a wedding present from St. Gaudens in 1884. The carved and gilded surface, decorated with floral scrolls, sets off the white marble surface. In contrast, the other portrait of Dr. Henry Schiff is made of bronze and is bordered by a frame of carved oak. Both of these frames were made by Joseph Cabus. Cabus, the earliest craftsman to make Stanford White's frames, did so from roughly 1882 to 1894. He was originally known as a cabinet maker, working for a short time with Alexander Rue before becoming partners with Anthony Kimball in the firm of Kimball and Cabus in 1863. The partnership was dissolved in 1882, at which point Joseph continued in business alone. During this time, he did considerable work for McKim, Mead & White, making interior architectural fittings and cabinet work. White's other principal frame makers included Alexander Cabus, Joseph's son, Oscar Rudolph, William C. LeBrock, and lastly, Newcomb Macklin. This frame on St. Gaudens' portrait of Louise Miller Howland, compared with an antique Florentine frame from the end of the 15th century, shows a possible source for the design. In both frames, we see a similar outline with an arched tympanum topped by projecting rosettes. Similarities are also evident between the design of the frame, which relies heavily on an architectural vocabulary, and the drawing for the entrance to the Judson Memorial Church, built around 1893 in Washington Square. In particular, White has used a demi-lune tympanum with rosettes and flanking columns with Corinthian capitals in both the frame and the doorway. This drawing for an unidentified relief, probably by St. Gaudens, again illustrates that White was inspired by Italian picture frames, this one made in Siena around 1490. Once again, we see an arched top with rosettes in both frames, and this time an antependium composed of volutes as well. Here are two other St. Gaudens reliefs with carved frames, Mrs. Schuyler Van Rensselaer and Sarah Redwood Lee and Helen Parrish Lee. White focuses attention on the sculptural reliefs by means of very spare ornament of a scalloped shell and cornucopias on Mrs. Van Rensselaer or carved roundels on the Lees. Also based largely on Italian Renaissance design are the tabernacle type frames, which are most often seen on Abbot Thayer's pictures. White referred to this group of frames as column or pilaster frames. Here we see a frame by Joseph Cabus on a Thayer painting of an angel, now in the collection of the National Museum of American Art. The decorative details, including suspended wreaths and bands of floral ornament, can also be seen in this detail of the tower of Madison Square Garden. In both cases, White has freely combined elements of various styles without regard to historical purity. Stanford White was always delighted to work with his artist friends. He wrote to Thayer in 1891, saying,
"I shall take pride and pleasure in making you a frame. Leave it to me. I promise you I will do my best."
Here is another tabernacle frame on a Thayer portrait of a young woman at the Metropolitan Museum. Interestingly enough, with a label from William Clausen, one of a number of stray framemakers who seems to have done occasional work for White. The drawing for a similar frame shows the same kind of spare architectural elegance. Here is another variation of a tabernacle frame. It was originally made for Abbot Thayer, but was used on this portrait of Eleanor Hardy Bunker, painted by her husband, Dennis Bunker, which was presented by White and some of his friends to the Metropolitan Museum as a memorial to the artist. The frame was made by Alexander Cabus, the son of Joseph Cabus, and the successor to his business. He made frames for Stanford White from about 1894 to 1901. White was very particular about the work that he had done and kept close tabs on his designs. He got off to a rough start with the younger Cabus and wrote to him in 1894.
"I understand from one or two people that you claim the right to make and have made frames for my designs without obtaining permission from me. I do not care to go into the truth of the matter, but simply say that in no case or under no circumstances are you to make a frame from one of my designs, or use the moldings of my designs in different combination, without the person wishing the frame or yourself first securing permission from me or my office."
Alexander Cabus later had a falling out with Stanford White over the botched reproduction of an antique frame. It seems that Cabus damaged the frame by taking it apart and ruining the gilding. White was intolerant of this kind of incompetence and made his feelings on the matter known. By 1899, White declared in a letter to the artist Abbot Thayer that young Cabus was no good as a frame maker. The Bunker frame is compared here with the detail of a window frame at the Century Club in New York, which White designed around 1899. It is interesting to see a similar combination of moldings and columns with bands of guilloche ornament. White's use of an architectural vocabulary for frame ornament can also be seen in the parallel curved lines on the lower part of the frame for Dewing's Study of a Woman Seated at the Freer and the frieze of one of White's loveliest buildings, Madison Square Presbyterian Church.